Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest inconsistencies and quirks. There are many friends, and they're gone now. There's a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did, and it'll hit me like a ton of bricks. They are gone now, and I'm only left with memories of them. I'm sorry for being mundane and even bringing everyone down, but I think it is the only way I can introduce my story and explain why I feel like I have to type this out. Well, I think that writing thing this is the only way I'll learn to accept that. I'll try and keep these downer identities to myself as I'm writing all this down, but I can't make any promises though. I know that being in a weird third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse, being the fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, that makes you a semi-functional tricycle. If you're a fifth wheel, you're left with some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or cares about. Imagine not being able to follow in the jokes and shared history of a couple and multiply that by two. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. It is the same frame of mind as I had. We all piled into Ian's car to go to Gila's National Forest for our hike. I know it's a weird opening to give you all, but after this depressing opening, I want to give you all the idea of my mindset. I'm not quite sure how I can describe all this, but I do know that all I need to do is tell someone. I need to tell somebody else of what happened and help me come across to terms with it. I think that the only way I'll be able to explain it would be to help you see from the perspective as much as possible. There were driving down to Gila for a hike, with me feeling like the fifth wheel wedged between two of Ian's friends who I didn't know. Three of us were crammed into the back seat, while Ian and his girlfriend were up front. I look back at the unnecessary bit of moping back to August of 2016 as one of the last few moments of normalcy I would have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation. I really did. Ian was more of social of us. Our mom used to tell us that Ian could make anyone his friend, and that once I had a friend, I could keep them. It was one of those little parental platitudes that were given to reassure a socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Fortunately, it would make me almost 19 years to learn that it wasn't true. Instead of taking my therapist's diagnosis of social anxiety disorder following a breakdown after an office get together as a means of seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself off from the world. And I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working, told myself that I was just doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that it wasn't healthy and convinced me to go on a long weekend hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday, after taking the day off of work, that I saw that he invited others along. I think he just used his means to help me get me into breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately, though, with Ian's extroverted nature, he didn't realize that I liked being in my shell. It was comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction where I caught no one's name except for those I already knew, my brothers and his girlfriend Jessica. Due to the morning grogginess and rush introduction, we packed up our car and left for our hike. It took 3 hours of mostly awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make a conversation, but my short responses and the others' sleepiness killed them off fairly quickly. We found that the parking lot near the Galea cliff dwellings, and we unpacked our gear. We took a moment then to bask in the beautiful sun sight that sat on perch above. Hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town into a face of a cliff. But however, though, 700 years ago, people managed to do just that. Given which just the parking lot was empty except for us, we would find out why later. I was in need of some social lubrication. We split into a 6-pack of beer, took in the majesty. Here's a picture in case if you're wondering what the area looked like. As we finished our beers, we got everything prepared and used the restrooms. Ian explained that the path we would be taking in full detail. What we didn't know is that my brother had failed to tell us that there was the West Fork Trail that had been closed that summer due to flooding. To be honest, that path wasn't that dangerous. They had just opted not clear due to recent flooding, so it would be a bit more of a rugged hike. But while it wasn't that precarious on itself, it still kept us from encountering other hikers, to which caused us a lot of problems when we actually needed help. Ian figured that we could just take it to another 3 miles per hour and be able to complete the Gala Loop, which is about 30 minutes long with enough to get back on track on Sunday, and be ready for our respective jobs on Monday. With no one else wiser, we had the backpacked closed section of the national park, as his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I can't recall, but I'll opt to include this picture rather than spend a page writing out everything. For the sake of this simply, this is where we were planning to take. I'll include more detailed map of the area below this well. In addition, I'll include more detailed map of the entire area, so you could pretty much get the orientate for yourselves. And if you want to trace the trail while we look, if you plan on following along with your path, as I tell you about this experience, all I can say is good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I just felt like I was lost as I was just then. I was going along with the group, trying to keep a positive mind about everything. I wanted to try and do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends. I think my circumstances had finally begun to settle in. I had been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year and I had no friends. I would go to work and then come home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend the entire weekend without saying a single word to anyone or seeing another person. I knew that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm, and that frightened me. On our first day was relatively quiet. We spent the majority of the time taking in on the sights, soaking in on the sun, and breathing in the fresh air. The hike, we felt, was constantly moving upwards, as I was unaccustomed to hiking. I frequently fell behind, but I never felt completely lost sight out of my brother's friends. While we took a break under the shade of the tree, whose bark looked like some dried scales from some long-dead alligator, I tried to make a small talk with everyone, but I fell into quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what have they been up to lately. When it came to them time to talk to the other two, I only managed to get the conversation going for a few sentences before it only shriveled up and died. I remembered assuring myself that it would be easier when we stopped for the night. We rested for a while before continuing to ascent up the mesa. This was where everyone realized how truly out of my element was here. The path from up the mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to have never stopped climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting and wheezing. Whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up, I tried to pretend I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or side glances, but it was easier said than done. It seemed like they were the outdoorsy type that had been doing this for years. By the time our path started out level, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until we reached the top and looked out for everything. I realized now how foolish that idea was. Even so, I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home. I had no idea where I was going or what the trail marketers had been using. I imagined splitting off from the group and trampling through poison ivy, bumbling into a gang of banjo-playing hillfolk, or getting lost in the wandering in circles until exhaustion and exposure took me. Even if I did manage to hike back to the parking lot, what was I going to do? Would I go back home into my empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, and feel sorry for myself again? I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at the dry section of the Indian Creek after having hiked a decent amount. Ian was confident that he would make it back on Sunday, and the next 2 days were going to be less instinctive. We ate some food and stowed the rest in the bear bag a ways away from the camp. We were passing the bottle of whiskey around of a campfire we had built during the conversation. Shifted into the most awkward moments, everyone had experiments. Ian then retold a story about the first time he met Jessica at a club where he was way too drunk for his own good, ended up puking into her purse. Jessica bristled at the memory and jokingly called Ian an asshole for that. Each person shared their stories about bumbling their first kiss when their braces got hooked together, locking themselves out of their dorm rooms in their underwear, and cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, caring for their drunken boyfriend who puked in their favorite bag, and then the bottle came to me, and it was my turn to tell them a story. I instantly knew that my most embarrassing story was the one on we started this conversation. I didn't tell them about the door, though. Instead, I made up a story saying I'm ripping my pants in front of the group of people. During that work interview, I had probably ripped straight from a 90s sitcom. They laughed at me and felt like I was a piece of shit. They had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments, that they were miscriminating in their shared experience. And here, I was too afraid to tell them the truth. To tell them about the door. The conversation continued for a bit afterwards as we hiked through the bottle. And when it was dead, we all went to bed still pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom. Still a bit fuzzy from the bulleted whiskey, I prompted out of the woods to do in my business. It wasn't until I was almost done that Nada's voice cut out in the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me, and I had just not gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about having a lighter in the back of the camp. She told me that she dropped hers and asked of me if I could help her look for it. But I was too out of the any good to anyone, so I told her that we'd look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling the protest as I stumbled back into my sleeping role. It still wasn't until I woke up the next morning to realize how stupid would I have been. Apparently they heard yowling in the surrounding woods last night. They thought that sound could have possibly belonged to the Mexican gray wolf, but no one was for sure. Ian knew that they inhabited this area, but were very uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf while out peeing in the middle of the woods. I decided that next time I wake up Ian, before going out to the woods, to answer the call of nature. We packed up a while later, after a light breakfast, and continued on our hike. After the second day was a little better, the overbearing sun I suffered under previously was hidden behind the heavy clouds. We crossed a number of rivers as we followed the 157-729 junction. After we went a little Bear Canyon, we headed towards the TJ Coral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge the patches of poison ivy and stinging needles. I fared much better on this hike, and despite nursing a slight hangover, I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around in my pack and clunky boots that my brother had loaned me. We had made camp around midday and purified some water from a nearby river, boiling, adding load line tablets to them. This at least a section of our hike didn't really have that many opportunities or drinkable water. At least, I think that's maybe what our counter last night was. The yipping and howling wolves added a bit of the seriousness to the hike. There wasn't anything joking around of our conversations this night. We talked a little bit, mainly just about something small to eat, while we stared into the campfire. Ian and Jessica had been the first to call it a night. I stayed with the others for a bit, but we were mainly silent. The other two slowly went off a bit after, as I decided to enjoy the warmth a bit longer, before getting ready to go to bed for the night. Just as I finished dousing the fire, I remember Gary coming up to me and asking me for a map. He told me that he wanted to plan out the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should visit. That wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's bag and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around his bag. He sounded angrier, and the longer he searched, He knocked his mess kits into the others as he peered into the pack and for something he was missing. Frustrated he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned around in the bag upside down and dumped out everything. He was practically ready to tear his own hair out, and it seemed that he had spent the whole entire morning looking for that thing. Wanting to know what was up, I walked to him and we started talking. He asked me, "Hey man, have you seen the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it." "Where is Gary? I gave it to him last night so he could map out a little detour to the trip so we could visit a spring." "Why don't you ask him? He probably knows," I asked. It was then that Ian had said something that changed everything. "Gary? Who are you talking about? Do you mean Oliver? Don't tell me you thought his name was..." I explained. "No, I'm talking about Gary. Tall guy, kinda lanky." "You're joking, right?" He looked at me with confused for a few seconds, and then made a questioning that sounded like really an old computer, trying to process something moments before it catches on fire. The pieces clicked in, and Ian shouted, "Who the fuck is Gary?" Getting the attention of everyone in the area. "He's what? Some frickin' guy asked you for our map in the middle of the night, and you just frickin' gave it to him? You handed our stuff to some random stranger you met in the woods?" I tried to explain to him and tell him that I knew Gary and that he did too, since I remember hiking with him the day before, but I couldn't find the words to convey that point. There was that Jessica stepped in and asked what was going on. Ian vented to her. "How frickin' stupid are you, Evan? Some random guy named Gary asks up for you in the middle of the night for our shit, and you could just give it to him? Jesus Christ, we need that map to get around smoothly, since the trails out here haven't been cleared." Ian shouted for about 15 minutes, while everyone became aware of their situation. Jessica managed to calm him down enough so we could figure out our next move. While we weren't completely screwed, as Ian memorized a large portion of the trail marketers, it was going to be a lot harder to navigate through the necessary junctions to bring us back around to our car. We packed up our stuff, making sure that the guy hadn't taken anything else we had left. The entire hike I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. Last time I had seen him this furious was just before he got into a fight with Aaron Fredlinger and beat him to a pulp. He got suspended for a week and Aaron got a black eye, busted lip, and never said anything about our mother again. Each time we came across the break-in path, we spent in a few moments while Ian trying to remember where to go. The fact that the trails had been closed and the paths were overgrown only swerve and make everything more difficult. I think that's how we made a wrong turn and began wandering the faint trail. I don't actually know if that's where we went wrong, since we didn't have the map on us that time, but it's my best guess. Further away from home and safety. Towards midday, tensions had reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things over that would make the sailor blush, while Jessica tried to hide the fact that she wasn't close to crying. Oliver attempted to lighten the situation, telling everyone that they just had to follow the compass and they should get home safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as she walked. I think she had the right idea, since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he had down the fifth vodka and was now trying to walk home on a tightrope while being randomly shocked by a cattle pod. Of course, the realization hit something deep down and made me want to throw up. I stopped walking and then began talking to Lucas. "What's going on with you, man?" Ian was still pissed off at me at the opportunity to vent a bit. "Huh? What are you talking about?" "Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. What's wrong with him? Don't be a chicken, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you this before the hike started about his condition." As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me clear as day, as I recalled Ian pulling me to the side, telling me about his friend's diagnosis and how he was likely going to be this last opportunity to undertake a long hike like this, so we had to help him move slowly. I remember watching him scramble up the hill and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthday wishes given to us from the hospital beds hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night. When she thought we were asleep, guilt flooded over me, and I stepped forward to apologize to Lucas. When it happened, Lucas growled at me at the instant. I took a step forward as he dropped the hunched position and his hands and feet. It almost looked like his skin was bristling with the possible threat that I could see. His broken skin and decaying teeth as he hissed at all of us before taking off at the hopping stride to the woods. He moved like those one CGI monstrosities from the last plane of the Ape movie. Of course, his shaky and unstable balance was replaced more with the unnatural animalistic gait as he loped over the distance and disappeared amongst the trees. The last thing I saw I assumed were his clothes slouching off his body, revealing that they weren't actually clothes, but gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first one to talk. What the fuck? As soon as Oliver said those words, it felt like a switch had been flipped, and everyone was sent into panic mode. We began to run along the trail, and it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I think a good 15 minutes or so for us to run out of energy with our heavy packs and disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breath, I surveyed the area around us and came to a terrible realization. Into our panic, we had run off in the path, and now we are deeper in the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remember Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over. What the hell was even that? The short answer was Lucas. Along with this, there was no Lucas, not really. I feel sorry for interrupting the story like this in the middle, but I think it's now trying best to explain everything. I know how confusing it seems that Gary and Lucas, but the truth is, I did. But because I don't think I could have had the appropriately explain it to you without the first experiencing it from my eyes. I don't know what to call those things, but they do have something to do with your mind. They institute themselves into memories and trap themselves into a world of recollections, and even though something is wrong, you can't quite put your finger on it. Your group of your 4 friends could grow 5, and you couldn't be any wiser. A part of you would stupidly admonish your ever-wandering many of there were. You do look at it, and you do realize the faces. You remember the events. You remember getting drunk at a bar together. You remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that has happened to you, but none of it is true. I don't know how it does. It crawls onto your skin and head and somehow makes you see things that benefits them. It can mold into memories, but it can mimic human environment. It walks on all 4s, not 2 feet. It growls, hisses, and snarls. It doesn't talk. It infuriates, observes, and waits. It's hunting us and driving us deeper into the woods. It was succeeding. We never really reached out much of a conclusion about what that thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of here as soon as possible. I watched Ian, and as he looked around the forest, it came to the realization that I did. We were lost. He didn't tell the others. I think he had realized that panicking would only get us into more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hope it worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sounds of distant animals yowling, calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered, and all those same noises they had from the first night out in the woods. Whatever this thing was, it was following us and calling out to the other things in the area. At the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about barreling out from underbrush, sinking its back into the rotting teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could react. I remember brushing that thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there were 6 of us here and we had actually encountered those creatures. As the day pressed on, it seemingly wandered south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot. I couldn't help but shake the nagging feeling of the back of my mind. It felt like I had forgotten some important deadline that I should have never forgotten about. It was until Oliver mentioned his wish back in the car with Jessica, stopped dead in their tracks. We all turned towards her, but we knew the coming was second, she said. We only took one car, right? Ian snapped, more fearful and frustrated. Of course we did. Remember how crammed everyone was in that tiny-ass Purus with our camping gear smashed in the trunks and on our laps? What about it? Jessica went white, as if it were the first time Ian had ever raised his voice to her. She paused for a moment before asking, how many of us are here now, and how many does your car seat have? Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably, and there were 6 of us out in the woods at that moment. Everything happened since Ian swore. Oliver's girlfriend gave a half shriek and gasped while I looked wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong here. Sarah was the only one who managed to say something before it's Sarah. She hadn't finished her words before her jaw popped open. I don't mean dropped open like astonished or something. It popped open like it had been dislocated from her face. The space between her lips and massive, slickly pink void of inflamed gums was all at least a foot wide. She looked at us with dead and dull eyes. She slowly raised the twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into more human-esque appearance. She popped it back into place in a hollow, sounding quelch of meat and bones, shifting as if nothing was wrong about what just happened, before she tried to speak again. Is me? Ian was the first to react. He stepped towards the failed face smile of the human, swinging his walking stick face at her. Get out of here! She hopped back in happy, slow motion, landed on all fours when she landed. Her body shuddered as an electrical jolt had passed through her. She slowly backed away from all of us, while facing Jessica at the same time. She hissed at us one last time before retreating deeper into the woods with a cultivating lope. It took a moment for us to regain our composure before we continued walking while trying to look at every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept on going through how no one was responding to him. Did you see how it moved? It was twitching like an epileptic in a rave. Have you ever seen one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing with twitching moving like those infected cows? What the hell is that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person would do that to their body? It tried to talk to us. He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because they were worried about that same thing hearing us, and although that wasn't really the case, we made up for him to stop talking because it only served to scare us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around the campfire and listened to the sound of high-pitched whining and yelping coming from all around us. It sounded like any time I actually got closer to falling asleep. The calls would start up and jolt me awake. We spoke in hushed whispers and tried to figure something out what they wanted with us, even though none of us really wanted to answer to that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke and we continued our hike. We spent Sunday hiking around and trying to find a similar site without any real sense of where we were going. Our only hope was to stumble upon another hiker or find an area with enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations we climbed didn't afford a good view of the area. It was extremely unlikely that we wouldn't find another hiker, due to the fact the trail had been closed and wasn't clear. Even if we did, there were some chances that we would trust him. They could be certain that he wasn't one of those things. Midway day came through the day, Ian whispered to me, "Count the people wearing backpacks. One of them is with us." I then casually looked over my shoulder, noticed that one of our group members was walking without any gear. They trailed behind us, but they were still in our vicinity. They moved slowly, but didn't show any signs of jerky movements than the previous two. The thought of it was learning mimic in our movements unsettled me without really thinking. I shucked off my backpack and approached the imposter. Before they knew what was happening, I shoved them as hard as I could. The instant hands pressed onto my shirt, I felt something slick and warm give me away of the outer layer of falling off of a rotten mango. Their shirt slid off their body into my hands. I quickly realized that it was the skin. The thing that actually was naked, but gave the appearance clothes, altering the color by almost translucent skin. I dropped the skin as I slaughtered it off, hit the ground with a wet flat slap. The creature toppled backwards, and it began yelping. I can only describe the sound like this. Imagine getting out of your bed in the middle of the night to go take a piss, as if you're feeling through the darkness to get to your room. You stepped on your dog's tail. Imagine a startled yelp of pain, and the shock came along with it. Now focus on that emotion when you felt when you heard that noise. Sudden surprise and guilt. In reality, the sound of it made it like it was nothing like a hurt dog. It just reminded me so much of a wounded pet that I can't even identify the sounds. Here's the worst part. I shouldn't have felt bad. Those things were stalking and tormenting us. They were likely hunting us. I felt bad for harming it. I shouldn't have felt bad about it, but it wanted me to do, and so I did. The thing writhed on the ground on for some few seconds, making a pitiable noise. It reached the back with its arms and pushed itself upright on its hands on the balls of its feet. Its joints popped wetly, and its muscles and bones adjusted to fit the new position. It crab walked around while shrieking the entire time as Ian pursued it, with his walking stick still helping to catch up to them and cave its head in. It wasn't like the thing had disappeared in sight. I realized that the shrieking wasn't just coming from the monster, but from Jessica as well. It was trying to mimic her response. With Ian gone and Jessica's screams possibly drawing more of those things to us, I decided that I had to do something. I stepped forward and wrapped her up in my arms. She was shaking a little like a leaf in the wind. I stroked her hair and whispered to her it was over. She managed to choke out something about its face. All I could make out was that there was something terribly wrong with its face. She calmed down, but of course, I told her that everything was going to be alright. I didn't believe that myself, but it was the only thing I could think of that might bring her comfort. Ian returned fuming with the monster that escaped, and I awkwardly broke the hug. Ian didn't say anything. He just started walking. We continued following him, hoping that he would find the way, but knowing that he probably wouldn't. 6 hours later, we settled down for the night. It felt like it had been circles going on all day. Made absolutely no progress. For all we knew, that thing could have been tinkering around with our memories and convincing us that familiar landmarks were new and leading us deeper into the woods. I didn't tell the others, but I think I knew what those things were. They wanted deeper into the woods to try and force us to exhaustion. When we were too weak to defend ourselves, they would descend upon us and eat us. Oliver, however, was right about that. If something is similar to us in any way, then those twitching spasms were likely some sort of prurient disorder that came from eating humans. After eating some jerky, since we decided to having a fire to draw more from them to us, we reached the conclusion that we would have to sleep in shifts. I volunteered the first watch before my insight into the monster's behavior had robbed me the desire to sleep. The others went off without as much as a word. They were exhausted, and it wasn't until an hour later into my watch that I realized I was too. Even given the monster's grotesque appearance, everyone needs to sleep. Jessica joined me about 2 hours into my watch. She admitted that she couldn't sleep after her encounter with the creature. I nodded in agreement. Both of us had seen something terrible, and that the others hadn't. We had talked for a good 30 minutes about what we thought was going on, how everyone was handling it. She was more worried about Ian. She confessed to me that he was acting erratic, and that he was scaring her. I wrapped my arm around her for a moment and told her that we were all scared. She then looked in my eyes and told me that she was glad I was there and I felt something twist deep down inside I had buried a long time ago when I first met her. The longer she stayed with me on my watch, the more personal our conversation became. She confessed that she and Ian had been fighting a lot recently, and that she was wondering if they were going to work it all out. At the start of their relationship, they were great together. It made her feel wonderful. But there was something that didn't feel right. Like there was something missing. I listened to her talk about everything that was going on in her life, and I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would later regret it. So I had to tell her about the door. She listened to me quietly as I told her everything. It was the event she participated in, and my breakdown at work, and my social anxiety disorder diagnosis at the therapist's office. Everything started off simply enough at the Friday after work, and I was in the lunchroom, eating my sandwich, reading a book as per usual, while my Fridays at my co-workers talked about their plans for the weekend. One of them was having a housewarming party, and they were inviting everyone at work. I figured that the invitation was only extended to the people that they were talking, until he asked me if I was able to make it on Saturday, as it was for the first time I had been invited to hang out after work. I chose to go. I spent the Saturday getting ready, planning on what the interesting topics would bring up in case that there was a lull in conversation. And the bottle of wine I was planning to give to him in the house was a warming gift. After psyching myself up, I left to go to the party with the bottle in hand. With my spirits high, I convinced myself that I was going to be there for the life of the party, and maybe if I play my cards right, I could finally get a friend at work that would make the time fly instead of dragging it on. It felt like that until I reached that house. The false bravado began to crumble apart. I stopped right in front of the neighbors' houses where everyone else had their car parked there. It was then I felt my heart beating like I just ran a mile. I began heading up the driveway with the wine bottle slick in my hands from my palms sweating. It wasn't until I reached the front door when I realized that something was terribly wrong. All that excitement that had been building up since Friday afternoon was now replaced with something else, apprehension. All those topics I had fought to seemed boring, and all reassurances I have given myself seemed hollow. I didn't feel prepared for any of this at all. At this point, the small part of me whispered something that has stuck with me to this day. The voice imitated that they never really wanted me to come out. They only given that invitation as a courtesy and didn't actually expect me to come to their house. It said that if I had knocked on their door, that they'd be making a fool of myself. It told me that I wasn't even comfortable into my own skin. To even so, how could I even dare imagine myself that they were enjoying my company? They wanted to celebrate with their friends. They didn't want to listen to the fumble or for something to talk about. All those fears flashed in front of me, taunting me, demanding me that I knock on the door, make myself look like an idiot. That part told me that I was better off alone. Instead, I listened. I turned around, even without knocking on the door, and I left. No one had come in, and the music was playing loudly, so I had no doubt they would have heard me anyways. I shouldn't have been here in the first place. Maybe I saw them watching me from the window. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they were laughing as I drove away, flustered and embarrassed. Maybe they went back to the party and joked about my social retard who had seemingly freaked out and ran away from their house when I went home and cried in the shower. Maybe. Jessica listened as I told her my story. She smiled sadly as I started to cry on her shoulder. All those feelings I had experienced outside of my coworker's house came rushing back. All that fear, foolishness, and fatalistic failure smashed into me like waves on shore. She whispered soothing words into my ear. It waited for me to collect myself. Once I did, she pulled me away and told me that it wasn't my fault. It was like under the moonlight, with her face inches away from mine, I did the worst thing I ever done in my life. I kissed her. It was slow, hesitant, romantic. I looked into her eyes and saw her beautiful face. She pulled me towards her as she leaned back. Lost in the moment, I held her against me while telling her all the things I would have said when I first met her. I realized that I loved her. I held her like that for a few moments, afraid that if I let her go, I would lose this perfect moment. She was warm, she smelled like wildflowers, she smelled like happiness. For the first time in like a lifetime, I felt comfortable and content. I didn't even know when I drifted off, but I do know waking up in the love-drunk excitement of the previous night. I didn't think once about Ian or the consequences of my decision. I only thought about Jessica, and I forgot that she was his girlfriend. What I did last night was a beautiful mistake. I convinced her to cheat on him with me. I needed to tell him before the truth came out. I needed him to understand how I felt. I got up from the ground and stretched. Jessica was gone. I assumed she went back to her sleeping role in the middle of the night. I walked over to Ian, who was just waking up. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and asked me if I stayed up all night.